The dust of redemption settled in a fine, gritty layer on everything coating the tongues of men and the hopes of dreamers. It was a town built on promises whispered in the dark, and Dalton Keene had long since stopped listening. He stood before the general store's dusty window, his reflection a ghost of the man he once was. Gaunt, sun-scorched with eyes that held the vast, empty expanse of the plains. Inside his pocket, a few coins rattled a lonely tune, enough for flour and coffee, but not enough to fill the hollowness inside him. The midday calm was a fragile thing, a held breath before a scream. It shattered with the explosive crack of a gunshot, followed by the tinkling symphony of the bank's front window collapsing onto the boardwalk. People scattered like quail flushed from cover, their shouts swallowed by the sudden sharp report of more gunfire. Men in dusters, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, spilled from the Redemption Savings and Trust canvas bags slung over their shoulders. Dalton, caught between the instinct to run and the paralysis of old memories, flattened himself against the wall of the general store. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. He was just a man trying to outlast the sun one miserable day at a time. The leader of the robbers, a tall man with a swagger that spoke of casual cruelty, barked orders as his men mounted their horses. He turned, scanning the street, his eyes sweeping over the cowering townsfolk. For a moment his gaze locked with Dalton's. The man's face was a stranger's, lean and hard, but the weapon in his hand was an old and terrible friend. It was a Colt Dragoon, its steel frame and barrel blued to a near black, but what stole the air from Dalton's lungs was the grip. It was polished bone, intricately inlaid with silver filigree that coiled like a serpent. A single perfect star was etched just below the hammer. Dalton knew that gun. He knew the weight of it, the specific kick as it fired the cold feel of the silver against a man's palm. He had seen it 10 years ago on a snow-swept mountain pass in the hand of a man whose last breath had fogged the frozen air. The sight of it now here in the dusty streets of Redemption was like a ghost reaching out from the grave. The world around him dissolved into a tunnel of memory. The sting of gunpowder and snow in the air. The desperate look in an outlaw's eyes. The final deafening roar of his own pistol. A life taken to save another. An act that had set in motion a chain of events he was only just beginning to understand. The robber's eyes, cold and blue, lingered on Dalton for a fraction of a second longer, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before he dismissed him as just another frightened face in the crowd. He swung into his saddle, raised the silver-inlaid Colt, and fired a single shot into the sky. The gang spurred their horses, thundering out of town and vanishing into a cloud of their own. Leaving behind shattered glass, stolen money, and a silence more profound than the one that had come before. Dalton remained pressed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bank robbery was a violent ripple on the surface of his life, but the sight of that pistol had dredged up a monster from the depths. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It had just been waiting patiently in the dust of redemption for the right moment to come and claim its due. He pushed himself off the wall, the flour and coffee forgotten. He had to get back to the ranch. He had to get back to the silence where ghosts were just memories, not flesh and blood men carrying silver-inlaid guns. The ride back to his ranch was a journey through a graveyard of his own making. The land, once fertile and full of promise, was now parched and barren. Dust coated the unplowed fields, a shroud over dead dreams. The windmill, its wooden blades splintered and still groaned, a thirsty complaint with every gust of wind, a sound like a dying man's last breath. His homestead was a testament to failure, a monument to loss that stood stark against the endless sky. This place had once echoed with life. With the laughter of his wife Sarah, her presence a warmth that had made even the harshest winter feel like spring. With the clumsy, joyful footsteps of his son Ben, a boy with his mother's eyes and a spirit as bright as a prairie fire. Now the only sound was the wind whispering through the cracked window panes, speaking of absence of silence, of the all-consuming fire that had taken them from him 5 years ago. The official report had called it an accident. A stray ember from the hearth, a gust of wind through the chimney. But Dalton knew better. He had built that fireplace with his own hands, stone by painstaking stone. It was sound. It was safe. The guilt was a physical weight he carried every day, a constant companion in the crushing loneliness. He had been in the barn tending to a sick calf, and by the time he saw the glow against the night sky, it was too late. The flames had devoured his world, leaving him with nothing but ash and the suffocating knowledge that he hadn't been there to save them. He unsaddled his horse, the familiar movements a hollow ritual. As he turned toward the house, a buggy crested the rise. It was a fine buggy pulled by a handsome black gelding, and the man holding the reins was Silas Ward. Ward was a pillar of the community in redemption, a man whose wealth had grown as mysteriously and rapidly as a mushroom after a rain. He was charismatic, always ready with a polite smile and a firm handshake, a man who projected an aura of respectability that made people trust him. Yet Dalton had always felt a chill in his presence, the unnerving stillness of a predator, waiting for its prey to weaken. Ward was systematically buying up the valley ranch by ranch, his polite offers always arriving just as a man was at his lowest ebb. Dalton Ward called his voice smooth as polished wood. He pulled the buggy to a halt, the picture of a concerned neighbor. I heard the commotion in town. A terrible business. I trust you are unharmed. I'm fine, Ward, Dalton said, his tone clipped. Ward's eyes, a pale and calculating blue, scanned the dilapidated ranch. They lingered on the sagging porch, the fallow fields, the general air of decay. His expression was one of perfect sympathy, but his gaze was an assessor's tallying up another man's misfortune. I won't mince words, Dalton. You know your note is past due. The bank is insistent. He sighed, a theatrical display of reluctance. I've tried to hold them off, but my influence only goes so far. However, I've come with a proposition. A way for you to walk away from this with your dignity and a little something in your pocket. He produced a folded deed from his coat. I'll buy the note, settle your debt completely, and I'll give you a fair price for the land. Enough to start fresh somewhere else. California, perhaps. The offer was polite, reasonable, and utterly predatory. It was a vulture offering to put a dying animal out of its misery. The land's not for sale. Dalton said the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. Ward's smile didn't falter, but the warmth vanished from his eyes. Don't be a fool, Dalton. This place is a tomb. It's killing you by inches. Let it go. He gestured to the surrounding land. The valley is changing. Progress is coming. A man must adapt or be swept away. The veiled threat hung in the air between them. Ward's progress felt less like a rising tide and more like a flood designed to drown anyone who stood in its way. The inevitable foreclosure felt cruel and deliberate, one more turn of the screw in a life defined by loss. I'll have your money, Dalton lied, clinging to a shard of pride. Of course you will, Ward said, his tone placating as if speaking to a child. He turned his buggy, the quiet crunch of the wheels on the dry earth sounding like the closing of a coffin lid. But time, my friend, is a luxury neither of us can afford. As Ward disappeared over the rise, Dalton was left with the silence and the dust. He looked at the house, at the empty chair on the porch where Sarah used to sit and watch the sunset. Ward was right. It was a tomb, but it was his tomb, filled with the ghosts he had earned. And he would not sell it for any price. 2 days later, they appeared at dawn, specters emerging from the morning mist. 5 riders moving with the silent, fluid grace of a flowing river. They were Apache, but they carried no visible weapons, and their approach was not that of a war party. Dalton watched from his cracked window, his hand resting on the stock of the old rifle propped against the wall. His heart, which had been a slow, tired drum since the bank robbery, picked up its tempo. The lead rider, a woman, dismounted with an authority that belied her slender frame. She moved to his fence post and placed a small, weathered object upon it. Dalton's breath hitched. He knew what it was before he could properly see it. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, the morning chill doing little to cool the sudden heat in his blood. It was a child's leather bracelet, torn and stained with blood, that had long since turned a dark, rusty brown. He hadn't seen it in 15 years, had thought it lost to the snow and the wolves and the passage of time. The woman stepped forward into the full light of the rising sun. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty forged in fire and hardship, not delicacy. Her eyes were dark and piercing, holding the wisdom of ages and the sharp edge of command. "You do not remember me," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was measured, intelligent, carrying an authority that could quiet a room or command 1,000 warriors. Dalton's gaze fell to the 3 small silvery scars on her left wrist, stark against her sun-darkened skin. The memory buried under years of grief and solitude broke through the surface. A blizzard, the howling of wolves, the desperate, terrified screams of a child. The wolves, he breathed the words, barely a whisper. "My name is Ayanna," she said, and the name was a verdict. "I am chief of the Redstone Apache." Chief. The word hung in the air, heavy with power and significance. He had saved a child. A chief had returned. Dalton walked slowly to the fence post and picked up the bracelet. The leather was stiff, but the intricate beadwork had been painstakingly repaired. His hands, calloused and rough from years of lonely labor, trembled as he held it. "I thought this was lost to the snow," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father believed a debt to your people was a stain." Ayanna replied, her tone cool and precise, yet hinting at the vulnerable child she had once been. "He is gone now. I am not my father." Her arrival was a stone dropped into the still, stagnant water of his life. The ripples were already spreading, disrupting the carefully laid plans of men like Silas Ward. This was not a social call. This was not a simple thank you. The chief of the Redstone Apache did not ride 50 miles to return a keepsake. "Why now?" Dalton asked, his voice still hoarse. Ayanna's gaze swept over his failing ranch, taking in every detail of his poverty with an unflinching eye. The assessment was swift, her conclusion clear. "I have come to settle a debt. Your debt. The one owed to Silas Ward." Dalton stared at her, baffled. "How do you know about that?" "My people have long memories, Dalton Keene, and our eyes see much from the high places. We have watched Silas Ward consume this valley ranch by ranch, lie by lie. We have watched him circle your land like a patient buzzard." She took a step closer, her presence a palpable force. "His pursuit of your land is not about a simple debt. It is about the railroad, and the railroad is about erasing my people from this valley forever." The revelation struck Dalton with the force of a physical blow. He was not just a failing rancher on the verge of foreclosure. He was a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game. "He means to take this land, declare it clear of all claims, and sell it to the Union Pacific," Ayanna explained. Your ranch is the final piece he needs to control the entire pass. With you gone, there is no one left to stand with us when he brings in the cavalry to enforce his fraudulent claims to our ancestral lands." Before Dalton could process the enormity of what she was saying, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the main road. It was Marshal Voss, and he was not alone. Silas Ward rode beside him, a smug, triumphant look on his face. This time there were no polite offers. This time they had come with the law on their side and a seizure notice in hand. Ayanna didn't even turn to look at them. Her eyes remained fixed on Dalton, a silent challenge in their depths. The still water of his life had been shattered. Now the storm was here. Silas Ward didn't bother with pleasantries this time. He dismounted with the confidence of a man who owned the world the seizure notice held aloft like a declaration of war. Marshal Voss, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly where Ward was concerned, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "It's over, Keen," Ward announced, his voice ringing with finality. "The grace period has expired. Marshal, do your duty." Voss shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking from Dalton to the 5 silent Apache warriors. "Dalton, you know the law. I have to ask you to vacate the premises." But Ward's plan, so simple on its face, had not accounted for Ayanna, and it certainly hadn't accounted for the chaos that had erupted in Redemption 2 days prior. "Marshal," Ayanna said, her voice calm and cutting, "before you enforce this man's claim, perhaps you should ask him where he was during the bank robbery 2 days ago." Ward froze, his smug expression faltering for the first time. "What are you talking about? I was in my office, as any number of people can attest." "Were you?" Ayanna countered. "Because a man of your influence surely would have been among the first to aid the town when it was under attack. Yet no one saw you. And it's a funny coincidence, isn't it, that a gang of armed robbers appears just in time to distract the entire county while you make your final move to seize the last piece of land you need for your railroad deal." The accusation was audacious, brilliant in its simplicity. It planted a seed of doubt that Ward couldn't easily uproot. But he was a cunning man, a predator who knew how to turn a threat into an opportunity. His mind worked quickly, twisting Ayanna's words into a weapon he could use against Dalton. "She's trying to deflect," Ward said, his voice rising with manufactured outrage. He turned to Voss. "Marshal, I think we both know who has a motive for robbery here. A desperate man about to lose everything." He pointed a trembling finger at Dalton. "And now he's brought in Apache savages to protect him. It all makes sense. He needed money to pay them off. He was in on it." It was a preposterous lie, but Ward delivered it with the conviction of a true believer. He didn't stop there. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small mud-caked canvas sack, the kind used by banks for coin. "My men found this by the creek bed at the edge of his property this morning," Ward declared, tossing the bag to the ground. It landed with a heavy clink of metal. "Looks like one of the bags dropped by the robbers." Voss stared at the bag, then at Dalton, his face a mask of suspicion and dawning certainty. Ward had laid the trap perfectly. He had used the robbery, an event Dalton had no part in, to frame him. He had planted evidence, and now he was using his standing in the community to sell the lie. Dalton, Voss said, his voice hard. "What do you have to say for yourself?" "It's a lie, Voss. You know me." "I thought I did," the marshal replied, his hand dropping to his gun. "But I don't know a man who consorts with hostiles and suddenly finds bank money on his land." "You're under arrest, Keen, for bank robbery and conspiracy." Dalton and Ayanna were no longer just fighting for a piece of land. They were fighting for Dalton's life and freedom. They were fugitives on their own property, the law itself twisted into a weapon against them. Ayana's warriors shifted their hands, moving toward the knives at their belts, but she held up a hand, stopping them. Open violence now would only prove Ward's point. "You are making a grave mistake," Marshal Ayana said, her voice low and dangerous. "The only mistake was letting this go on for so long." Ward snarled. "Take him." As Voss and his two deputies stepped forward, their guns drawn, Dalton knew he had two choices: surrender to a lie, and hang or fight for the truth and likely die right here. He looked at Ayana, and in her eyes, he saw a third option. Not fight, not surrender. Disappear. With a sharp cry in her native tongue, Ayana wheeled her horse around. Her warriors followed suit, creating a whirlwind of dust and confusion. In that brief, chaotic moment, one of them grabbed the reins of Dalton's horse, pulling it alongside them. "Come," Ayana commanded. Dalton didn't hesitate. He swung into the saddle as Voss and his men coughed in the dust cloud. Gunshots rang out, but they were wild, unaimed. By the time the dust began to settle, Dalton and the Apache were gone, vanishing into the rocky canyons that bordered his land, a place where the law of redemption held no sway, and where a man's only hope for justice lay in his own hands. They were running not from the law, but from the man who had bought and paid for it. The canyons were a labyrinth of shadow and stone, a place the Redstone Apache knew as well as their own history. They moved through the winding passages with a practiced ease that left Dalton breathless. For 2 days they lay low in a hidden alcove, a stream providing fresh water, while one of Ayana's warriors, a young brave named Kale, scouted the area. Dalton re-energized by the fight, for his name felt a purpose he hadn't known in years. The lethargy of grief was being burned away by the clean fire of injustice. "Ward won't just be celebrating," Dalton said, pacing the narrow confines of their hideout. "He'll be cementing his story, bribing witnesses, paying people to remember things they never saw." "He is a snake who sheds his skin to fit the season," Ayana agreed, sharpening a hunting knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "But even a snake leaves a trail. We must find it." Their investigation began under the cloak of darkness. Kyle, who had slipped into redemption unseen, returned with news. Marshal Voss had a new deputy, a young man named Elias Miller, fresh from the East and full of ideals about the law. He was sharp, and according to the whispers Kyle had overheard in the saloon, he was asking questions that made Voss uncomfortable. Questions about the lack of tracks around the planted money bag, about the convenient timing of its discovery. "A man with questions is a man who can be reasoned with," Ayana observed. "Or a man who can be silenced," Dalton countered grimly. "Ward can't afford loose ends." Their next ally came from a more unlikely source. Jedediah, an old prospector who lived like a hermit in the hills, had been panning for gold in the creek the morning Ward's men had planted the evidence. Ayana sent Kale with a pouch of tobacco as a peace offering. The old man, who trusted the Apache far more than the land-grabbing suits in town, confirmed what they suspected. He had seen 2 of Ward's hired hands near the creek bed just after sunrise. They weren't looking for gold. Neither Jedediah had told Kale, his voice a gravelly rasp. They was burying something. Looked mighty guilty about it, too. This was their first piece of concrete evidence, a witness who could dismantle Ward's frame-up. But it wasn't enough. They needed to uncover the rot at the core of Ward's empire. They needed to understand why. The railroad deal was a powerful motive, but Dalton felt something else at play, something personal in the way Ward looked at him. A deep-seated hatred that went beyond business. The clue came from Jedediah. "Funny thing about that Ward fella," the old prospector had mused to Kale. "Puts me in mind of another slick talker from about 10, maybe 12 years back. fella named Hayes, Elias Hayes, had the same pale fish-belly eyes. Vanished right after his brother, a real nasty piece of work named Caleb, got himself killed up on Whisperin' Pass. The name hit Dalton like a physical blow. Caleb Hayes, the outlaw with the silver-inlaid Colt Dragoon, the man he had killed in a gunfight a decade ago. He remembered the face of the bank robber, the one who carried that same unique pistol. A brother. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far more terrifying than a simple land grab. Ayanna, seeing the look on Dalton's face, knew the name meant something. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb Hayes was a killer. Dalton explained, his voice low. He and his gang were robbing stagecoaches. I was part of the posse that went after them. We cornered them on the pass in a blizzard. It was him or me. He looked at his hands, remembering the cold weight of the gun, the finality of the shot. I never knew he had a brother. The investigation now had a new urgent focus. They needed proof that Silas Ward and Elias Hayes were the same man. Ayanna devised a plan. While her warriors created a diversion at the far end of the valley, drawing the attention of Voss and his deputies, she and Dalton would slip into Redemption and search the county land office. Under the cover of a moonless night, they moved like shadows through the town's deserted streets. The land office was a small, unassuming building, its lock easily defeated by Ayanna's deft hands. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and ink. Working by the dim light of a shielded lantern, they began to sift through stacks of deeds and records. They found what they were looking for in a dusty ledger from 12 years prior. A land deed for a small failed claim, signed with a flamboyant looping signature. Elias Hayes. They compared it to a recent document signed by Silas Ward. The name was different, but the flourish was identical. A distinctive, arrogant loop on the final S that was as unique as a fingerprint. It was the proof they needed. Silas Ward had created a new identity, built a fortune, and returned to the one place that held the ghost of his brother. But why this elaborate, decade-long scheme? As Dalton stared at the two signatures, a cold dread began to creep up his spine. This wasn't just about the railroad. It was about him. The truth, when it finally coalesced in the dusty silence of the land office, was more monstrous than anything Dalton could have imagined. Staring at the two signatures, Elias Hayes and Silas Ward, he felt the last 10 years of his life realign into a horrifying new shape. The bank robber with Caleb Hayes' distinctive pistol was no stranger. He was likely an old member of Caleb's gang, now recruited by the vengeful brother. The systematic ruin of the valley's ranchers wasn't just business. It was the slow, methodical clearing of a chessboard. And Dalton Keene was the king. This was never about the land, Dalton whispered, the realization sucking the air from the room. It was always about me. Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes seeing the storm of understanding and horror gathering on his face. What do you mean? Caleb Hayes. I killed him. All of this, is revenge. He explained the gunfight on the pass, the snow, the finality of it. He had been a younger man, and then a man who believed in the simple arithmetic of justice. He had taken a killer's life to save the lives of others. He had never considered the ripples that single act would create. Elias Hayes, under the guise of Silas Ward, hadn't just wanted the valley. He wanted to strip Dalton of everything he loved, to make him watch his world burn to ash, just as Elias felt Dalton had burned his. And then the final devastating piece of the puzzle slotted into place. His mind flew back 5 years to the night of the fire. The stray ember, the accident, the guilt that had been his constant companion, his penance for failing his family. The fire, Dalton choked out, staggering back against a filing cabinet as if struck. It wasn't an accident. It was arson. the first most cruel act of Elias Hayes's vengeance. He hadn't just wanted Dalton to suffer. He had wanted him to live crushed under the belief that he was responsible, to be isolated, broken, and forgotten, to be slowly destroyed by the memory of his own failure before the final blow of losing his land and the last tangible piece of his life with Sarah and Ben was delivered. The revelation transformed the fight completely. This was no longer a struggle for land or even for his freedom. It was a battle for the memory of his wife and son, a reckoning for a crime so profound it had reshaped his very soul. The grief he had carried for 5 years curdled into a white-hot rage, a desire for a justice that no court could ever provide. He now understood the cold, predatory look in Ward's eyes. It was the look of a man who had watched his enemy suffer for years, savoring every moment of his slow demise. They left the land office with the ledger page tucked safely in Dalton's shirt. The knowledge they now possessed was a heavy burden, but also a powerful weapon. As they slipped back into the shadows, the town of Redemption seemed different, its false front of civility stripped away to reveal the corruption festering beneath. On their way out of town, they sought out Deputy Miller. They found him making his late-night rounds, his face etched with the weariness of a man at odds with his conscience. Dalton, emerging from an alley, startled him. "Keen, I should arrest you right now." You could, Dalton said, his voice level and cold. Or you could listen to the truth and decide what side of the law you're really on. They showed him the signature, told him the story of Caleb Hayes, of Silas Ward's true identity. They told him about Jedediah's testimony. Miller, who had already harbored doubts, listened intently, his skepticism warring with the undeniable logic of their story. The pieces fit too well. The frame up Ward's obsession with Dalton's land, the sheer overkill of his methods. It all made sense through the lens of a personal vendetta. If this is true, Miller began, his mind reeling with the implications. It means the man who runs this town is a fraud and a murderer Ayanna finished for him. And he is using Marshal Voss and you as his puppets. They left him there in the dark street, the seeds of truth planted. They had exposed Ward's identity, but in doing so, they had cornered a very dangerous animal. A man who had spent a decade meticulously building a new life would not see it dismantled without a fight. The polite, charismatic Silas Ward was a fiction. Dalton knew with chilling certainty that they were about to meet the real Elias Hayes. The moment Silas Ward, the real Elias Hayes, realized his meticulously constructed world was crumbling, the mask of civility burned away, revealing the raw, violent nature beneath. News of Deputy Miller's renewed, pointed questioning must have reached him, because his response was swift and brutal. He abandoned all pretense of legal maneuvering and embraced the tactics his brother would have applauded. The bank robbers from Redemption, Caleb Hayes's old gang, reappeared. No longer phantoms of a chaotic memory, they were now a tangible, deadly force. They rode into the valley not as thieves, but as Ward's private army, their silver-inlaid pistols and shotguns gleaming in the sun. They were a dozen strong hard men with nothing to lose, bought and paid for, with the fortune Ward had amassed through his lies. But Ward's masterstroke of escalation came from a more legitimate source. He rode to Fort Collins, not with lies about Apache aggression this time, but with something far more insidious: money. He found a willing partner in Colonel Brennan, a man whose ambition and greed far outstripped his honor. Ward's tale was simple and persuasive. The Redstone Apache, under their radical chief Ayanna, were inciting local ranchers to violence, interfering with the lawful expansion of the railroad, a project of national importance and threatening federal authority. He sealed the deal with a chest of gold that was meant for the railroad investors. The threat was no longer foreclosure or a prison cell. It was a small-scale war. Colonel Brennan, citing a non-existent threat to territorial stability, mobilized 2 companies of cavalry. His official objective was to pacify the region and remove the hostile Apache presence. His real objective was to crush Dalton and Ayanna, clearing the way for Ward's railroad deal and filling his own pockets. The valley became an armed camp. Dalton's ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, transformed into a bastion of defiance. The other ranchers' men Ward had cheated and bullied for years saw the cavalry and the hired gunslingers and knew the time for silent suffering was over. Thomas McCarty, Samuel Brooks, Ezra Tate. They came not as neighbors, but as soldiers, their old hunting rifles and farm tools repurposed for war. They brought their families their meager supplies and a shared hardened resolve. What Ward had intended as a final overwhelming show of force had instead galvanized his opposition. "He's brought the devil to our doorstep," McCarty said, watching from a ridge as Brennan's cavalry made camp at the mouth of the valley. "Then we'll send him back to hell." Dalton replied, the words coming from a part of himself he thought long dead. The broken man was gone, replaced by a leader forged in the crucible of Ward's hatred. Ayanna organized the defense with the calm precision of a seasoned general. Her warriors taught the ranchers how to use the terrain for cover, how to fight a guerrilla war against a superior force. They set traps in the narrow canyon passes and established a network of lookouts. The fight for one man's land had become a fight for the soul of the valley, a desperate stand for the lives of Ayanna's people, for the wronged ranchers, and for the possibility of justice in a lawless land. The first skirmish was short and brutal. A cavalry patrol sent to probe their defenses was expertly ambushed in a rocky gorge. Ayanna's warriors, using bows and arrows from the cliffs above, created chaos without revealing their numbers or positions. The soldiers, unnerved by an unseen enemy, retreated in disarray. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. It proved they could fight back. It proved they would not be swept away. But as night fell, a new tension settled over the camp. Deputy Miller arrived, his horse lathered, his face pale. He had come to warn them. "Voss is a lost cause. He's too deep in Ward's pocket," the young deputy reported breathlessly. "But it's worse than that. Ward isn't with the cavalry. He and his gunslingers separated from the main column. They're moving through the Badlands, planning to attack the ranch from the south at first light, while Brennan's cavalry pins you down from the north." It was a classic pincer movement designed to crush them completely. Ward wasn't just directing the battle. He was coming himself. He was coming for Dalton to finish the vendetta he had started a decade ago, to look the man who killed his brother in the eye as he destroyed the last remnants of his world. The wind began to howl just before dawn, a mournful cry that rose to a furious scream. It carried with it a wall of dust and sand, a churning, roiling mass that descended upon the valley like a biblical plague. The sun vanished, the world reduced to a maelstrom of brown and gray visibility, shrinking to a few feet. The sandstorm was a chaotic, disorienting force of nature, a fitting backdrop for the final confrontation. It was the cover they needed. Under the cloak of the storm, Ayanna led the ranchers and half her warriors to intercept Colonel Brennan's cavalry, using the wind and sand to mask their movements, turning the environment itself into a weapon. Dalton, along with Cale and 2 other Apache warriors, remained at the ranch waiting for Ward. They didn't have to wait long. Figures emerged from the swirling dust, wraith-like and silent. Ward and his gang of 10 gunslingers. They moved with the quiet confidence of predators, closing in for the kill, expecting to find their prey cowering and blind. The battle for the ranch was brutal and intimate, fought in the suffocating chaos of the storm. Gunshots were muffled by the wind flashes of light in the gloom. It was a fight of instinct and shadow. Dalton, moving through the familiar landscape of his own property, had the advantage. He and the Apache warriors were ghosts in the storm, striking and fading back into the brown haze. One by one, Ward's men fell their surprise, turning to panicked blind, firing into the gale. Finally, only 2 men were left standing amidst the swirling chaos, Dalton and Elias Hayes. Ward stood near the barn, his face a mask of rage and grit, and the charismatic facade of Silas Ward sandblasted away forever. In his hand, he held the silver-inlaid Colt Dragoon, his brother's gun. "Keen," he roared, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Face me. Face the man whose life you destroyed." Dalton stepped out from behind the water trough, his own pistol steady in his hand. "Your brother was a killer, Elias. He made his choice. My brother was my family." Hayes screamed back, his eyes wild with a decade of nurtured hate. "You took him from me, so I took everything from you. Your wife, your son." I heard them screaming Keen. It was a beautiful sound. The confession spat into the wind was meant to break him. But instead it focused Dalton's rage into a single sharp point. This was it, the moment of reckoning. But as he raised his pistol, a new figure stumbled out of the barn door, shoved forward by Hayes. It was Deputy Miller, his hands bound, a gun pressed to his temple. I found him snooping where he didn't belong. Hayes sneered, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He had his hostage, his final cruel twist of the knife. "Now you have a choice, Keen. Your righteous revenge, or this boy's life. Drop your gun, or he dies right here. Let's see what kind of hero you really are. Hero, you." Dalton froze, his finger tightening on the trigger. The choice was a moral razor's edge. Kill the man who murdered his family, and sacrifice an innocent, or surrender and allow evil to win. The storm raged around them, a physical manifestation of the tempest in his soul. This was the true test, not of his aim, but of his character. The old Dalton, the broken man consumed by grief and guilt, might have pulled the trigger. But the man standing there now, a man who had fought alongside honorable people and rediscovered his own worth, could not. He had to defeat Elias Hayes, not with the rage that had consumed them both, but with the honor and clarity he had lost for so long. Slowly, deliberately, Dalton lowered his pistol and let it drop into the dust. Hayes laughed, a harsh grating sound. "I knew it. You're weak, just like you were when you let your family burn." He shoved Miller to his knees. "Now you get to watch again." But Dalton's surrender was not weakness. It was a strategy. As he had lowered his gun, his eyes had darted to the hayloft pulley system, a thick rope and a heavy iron hook hanging directly above the barn door. It was a desperate gamble. "You're right, Elias," Dalton said, his voice calm, drawing Hayes' full attention. "You win." As Hayes savored his moment, his grip on Miller loosening for a fraction of a second, Dalton lunged for the coiled rope tethered to a nearby post. With all his strength, he yanked. The release mechanism, old and rusty, gave way with a screech of protesting metal. The heavy iron hook used for lifting hay bales plummeted from the loft. Hayes, hearing the sound, looked up an instant too late. The hook didn't kill him, but it struck his shoulder with crushing force, sending the Colt Dragoon flying from his nerveless fingers. He screamed in agony as Miller scrambled away. The fight was over. Dalton stood over the writhing, defeated man, his face not of a victor, but of someone who had stared into the abyss and chosen to step back. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound, weary peace. Justice would not come from the barrel of his gun, but from the truth finally brought to light. As if on cue, the fury of the sandstorm began to wane. The wind lessened its scream to a whisper, and the thick brown curtain of dust started to thin, revealing a world washed in a muted, ethereal light. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a series of stark, quiet tableaus. Elias Hayes lay on the ground, clutching his shattered shoulder, his decade-long quest for vengeance, ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimpers of a broken man. The bodies of his hired gunslingers were scattered around the ranch, half buried in the newly settled dust-grim monuments to a pointless war. From the north, Ayanna and her forces emerged from the canyons. They had been successful. Their guerrilla tactics, amplified by the storm, had sown chaos and confusion among Colonel Brennan's cavalry. They hadn't needed to win a pitched battle. They only needed to hold them off. Their return coincided with the arrival of two new parties. The first was a small contingent of cavalry, but these soldiers were not led by Brennan. A young lieutenant, his face grim with purpose, rode forward. He had witnessed Brennan's private meeting with Ward and had seen the gold change hands. His conscience had won out over his loyalty to a corrupt commander. He had ridden through the night to bring word to the territorial capital, and his testimony would be the final nail in Brennan's coffin. The colonel was promptly arrested by his own men. The second arrival was a carriage bearing the seal of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Agent Marcus Whitmore, the very man Ayanna had sent for days ago as a contingency, stepped out, his face a mask of stern authority. He had been delayed by the storm, but his arrival now, with the full weight of federal power behind him, was perfectly timed. The cleanup was a somber affair. The ranchers who had fought so bravely alongside Dalton helped round up the remaining demoralized members of Ward's gang. Deputy Miller, his youthful idealism now tempered by harsh reality, took charge of transporting Elias Hayes to face federal justice for his myriad crimes, including the murder of Sarah and Ben Keene. As the authorities sorted through the legal and military wreckage, a quiet, powerful scene unfolded between Dalton and Ayanna. They stood by the creek, surveying the damage to his ranch and the splintered fences, the bullet-pocked walls of his home. They didn't speak of friendship or the future. They didn't need to. The shared experience of the last few days, the trial by fire and dust, had forged a bond of mutual respect deeper than words could ever express. "The land is wounded," Ayanna said softly, her gaze on the scarred landscape, "but it will heal." Dalton looked at her, then back at his home. For the first time, he was seeing past the pain and the ghosts. The fire that had destroyed his family had been set by another man's hatred, not his own failure. The guilt he had carried for 5 years was a lie, a chain he had unknowingly allowed his enemy to place upon him. As he stood there watching the last of the dust settle, he felt that chain break. He was finally truly beginning to heal as well. In the weeks that followed, the valley was reborn. Elias Hayes was tried and convicted, his confession to the arson, a final damning piece of testimony that echoed across the territory. His ill-gotten empire was dismantled, and the stolen land was returned to the ranchers. He had wronged their deeds, now bearing the undeniable stamp of federal authority. Colonel Brennan was court-martialed, his career ending in disgrace. Ayanna, working with Agent Whitmore, solidified her tribe's land rights, negotiating a new fair treaty that guaranteed the sanctity of their ancestral grounds and established prosperous trade agreements. Her leadership, tested in conflict, was now unassailable. For Dalton, the resolution was more personal, quieter. While clearing the wreckage from a corner of his barn that had been damaged in the fight, his shovel struck something solid. It was a small, fire-scorched metal box. He had assumed it was destroyed in the fire that took his home, but it had been in the barn with him that fateful night, forgotten in the chaos and grief that followed. With trembling hands, he pried open the warped lid. Inside, protected from the worst of the heat, was a small stack of letters. On top was one from Sarah, written on the morning of the day she died. He sat down on an overturned bucket, the sounds of the rebuilding ranch fading into the background, and read his wife's words. The letter was not a grand farewell or a prophecy. It was full of life, of love, of simple plans for their future. She wrote about the dress she was mending for the town social, about Ben's first wobbly tooth, about the sunset she had watched from the porch the night before, thinking of him. It was a portrait of a life so full of hope, a love so strong that not even the flames of Elias Hayes's hatred could truly extinguish it. It was the final, emotional closure. He needed a gift from the ghost who had haunted him for so long now, free to rest. The following Sunday, Dalton rode to the small hill overlooking his ranch, where 2 new headstones stood carved from clean white stone. Sarah, Keene beloved wife and mother. Benjamin, Keene beloved son. He knelt and cleared away a few stray weeds. From his pocket he took Sarah's locket, which he had carried every day for 5 years like a penance. He gently polished its surface and laid it at the base of her stone, no longer a symbol of his guilt, but a tribute to a memory now cleansed of pain. He had accepted their loss and found peace in the truth. As he stood, he saw Ayanna riding toward him. She reined in her horse at the bottom of the hill, waiting for him, a silent sentinel of their shared victory. Dalton walked down to join her. Together they stood looking out at the healing land and the green shoots of new grass already pushing through the dust. He was no longer a forgotten man, haunted by ghosts in a tomb of his own making. He was a symbol of resilience, a man who had walked through the fire of another's vengeance and emerged whole, his honor reforged. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in years, it felt full of hope.